I think we should probably begin. The panel right now is TAMIZDAT from Eastern and Central Europe. My name is Ron Meyer. I'm from the Harriman Institute at Columbia University. Our first speaker is Jessie Labov, Central European University of Budapest. That in itself is probably an interesting topic at the moment.
Where did you say it was?
Precisely. Maybe Warsaw. And her topic today is the Transatlantic Central Europe. Where do texts lead us when they emerge from the underground? We're ready to do, Jessie.
And we have 15 or 20, or what's the story?
Around 20 minutes.
All right, I'll start this so I can not take too much time. Nice, let me open this up. Okay, and try to yell if I'm too loud, okay? So, first of all, in addition to the regular thank yous, Yasha and Polina for organizing this, for all of the people that have spoken already and given me already a lot of new thoughts about the field I thought I worked in. I also just wanted to take a little moment to think about what it means to present on Central Europe when you're at a conference which is basically about Russian literature. And it puts me in an oddly marginal position, which I've escaped a little bit by working in the region. But it also makes me appreciate the fact that a lot of the things that I might say or claim might only apply to the kinds of texts and the kinds of circulation I'm studying and interested in Central and Southeastern Europe. So I'm going to pose that as a kind of a question at the beginning. So if I make some claims about what I think TAMIZDAT or extraterritorial publishing is, that I can ask you preemptively if it applies to the Russian case as well. I also wanted to excuse my discussant, Roman, because he has no idea what I'm going to say, like none. And in fact, there's even comments and points in here that came up during the last presentation and the last commentary. So it's a very fresh and reactive presentation. And I'm going to switch between this PowerPoint and then eventually I'm going to switch back over to my machine and show you some other kinds of visuals. So, in the very first session of this conference, Professor Matic invoked the spatial turn as a way of deterritorializing TAMIZDAT and cited Foucault and Soja and calling for understanding our cultural production as a network. We've heard that word many times, even just today. Yet that network as it was described here, or just in one definition that we encountered yesterday, as solely a communication between the Russian underground writer and some place of publication outside, for the sole purpose of smuggling texts back into the Russian sphere, seems to me like a very closed circuit. And as an analogy, I was kind of thinking this through for much of last evening, coming up with the right analogy. I'm going to speak directly to Yasha because he and I have been in dialogue about this. So it's like if you had sent a rocket up into space with a dog in it, and it came back with a pig in it. And so your reaction would be like, this is great, we need more pigs. And my reaction is like, there's extraterrestrial life. What's out there? How did that dog become a pig? So you see, we're two sides of the same question. But I'm very interested in what is in that vacuum outside of the Russian sphere of communication. Or in my case, the Central European sphere. And I kept thinking about the difference between these two perspectives, and it might just be one of task. Because the project that I'm quite entranced by, that is set out by the website and the project and the conference itself, is really one of further enriching an existing canon. The canon of Russian literature, the canon of Russian underground literature. It's not a descriptive project like Anne's samizdat periodical database, which builds meanings from the material conditions and the provenances of those texts, but rather what I called yesterday a forensic game of genre, of literary history, of biography, prosopography. So you, I'm just personifying poor Yasha, but I really mean like you as someone engaged in this project, but I'm trying to analyze it. You're in the archive to gather evidence, not to tell the story of the archive itself. So I think Anne's story primarily is the story of the archive itself, and what you're doing is gathering evidence there, and she might disagree. The difference might also be disciplinary between the dogs into pigs and what's in space. So if the primary mode of operation is literary history, literary theory, intellectual history, the politics of literature, then this really falls under what I would call critical textual scholarship. right? What we're trying to do is we're trying to enhance the canon by learning more and more and more. Another key moment for me yesterday is very symptomatic. I'm sorry to analyze you, but Yasha pointed out in such a organic and genuine way that you didn't want people to read these unauthorized editions of these texts as the actual text, because authorized editions exist, right? So that means they're not text but paratext. And everything is paratextual in this project. So there's an authorized edition of the text, the standard edition, all the evidence that we're gathering here in this conference about Russian literature is supplementary to the authorized versions. And what they'll do, these supplementary paratextual pieces of evidence, is allow us to understand the real text more deeply, because we'll have traveled with it on this peregrination up into space and back, right? So there's more differences, obviously. I mentioned the Russia versus Central Europe, the fact that most of the TAMIZDAT project is about books. And today, in fact, in the first session, we heard quite a lot about the hybrid and messy bunch of materials that make their way into periodicals sometimes, or other forms of publishing, like anthologies. And I'm just going to try to describe a little bit the work that Frederica Kovac and I have done, which had a different task and interacts with different disciplines. I don't know if it'll be helpful to contrast them, but I'm kind of hoping it will be. So our task was not to define a canon, but to describe a phenomenon, something that Ben Nathan's just called a technique, I think. And we call it the samizdat system. So already you know that you're outside of a textual scholarship project. It's situated at the intersection of cultural intellectual history, that's where we combine forces, political philosophy, book history, media studies, sociology and anthropology, literary studies. So in this conversation that Frederica and I are having, largely with historians, I want to point out, the literary text itself is highly instrumentalized. And I'm just going to show this book, which is the book that sort of captures what we're trying to say, by expanding the definitions of samizdat and tamizdat beyond anything that anyone really considers makes sense. So like we're on the internet and we're in Iran, like, you know. So we pushed the definition so far that it loses its meaning on purpose. But also Frederica's book, which is a much more responsible study, I would call it, of what it really means to read underground literature on the other side of the curtain. And I have here a quote from her book, which explains exactly how profoundly different it is from the task of building a canon. So she says that underground texts smuggled out of the Soviet orbit profoundly changed the minds of the people in Cold War Europe. TAMIZDAT provides a lens through which to explore how the reciprocal transfer of literature between East and West slowly but persistently created a transnational network of intellectual and literary influences. Sorry to rush through that, but I really wanted to get to the blue. This entanglement gives rise to the difficult question of texts' reception outside of their place of origin, however. I'll sort of skip the rest of the quote. That's the perspective that, that we're looking at. And actually, it came up yesterday in Polina's talk as well, when she was talking about the network of correspondence around Salisbury's work and about the siege of Leningrad, and how it would just, by definition, have to be more multivalent, because so many different people were interacting with him. So my initial plan for this presentation was to use some of the tools of visualization that I have at my grasp from digital humanities and go back to this study. Go back to this topic, cross-currents in the Yearbook of Central European culture. That plan has changed in the last 24 hours, so you'll get to see a slightly different presentation than I planned to give, but I'll show you some of the stuff I'm working on anyway in my remaining couple of minutes. I spent a lot of my 20s and 30s working on this journal, Cross-Currents, a Yearbook of Central European Culture, and I was pretty sure I was done with it. For those of you that are not familiar with it, I don't know how many people in here would have come across it. Certainly those that were working in publishing in the 80s, but maybe not those that have been working in publishing since. It's a journal or a yearbook, came out once a year, first published at University of Michigan, later at Yale. It ran from 1982 to 1994, and it by no means could be considered classic TAMIZDAT, right? It's not designed to go back into the country. It's this big and it's really heavy. You could use it to, open a door and hold it there, but you really couldn't smuggle it easily. Very few copies seem to have made their way back in. It was edited by an emigre from Czechoslovakia, Ladislav Matejka. Its main audience was not the Czech diasporic community or even readers back in the home country, as we expect from classic extraterritorial or emigre publishing, but rather a wider academic public, academic and intellectual circles who read up on things, right? So Matejka imagined it as a kind of a Central European supplement to the New York Review of Books. And Frederica's book that I just mentioned spends quite a lot of time in the archives of the New York Review of Books. That's one of the conversations she's very interested in. So I'll spend the rest of my presentation analyzing the contents of Cross-Currents from various perspectives. I'm going to try to talk about, again, what it means to enter this Western theater of ideas with these underground texts, or in the case of Cross-Currents, hybrid texts. So I mentioned the different audiences and the question of reception. The different goal is here one of influence of Western thinking and perspective, as well as simply speaking back to those at home. Some texts in this journal are translations of articles and essays that originally appeared underground, so that brings up a question of what is the status of a translation, who is it speaking to, who is it for? And one question I've always had is, where did these texts come from and how much did they recirculate in quantitative terms? So in contemporary terms, I'd really be asking about the journal's impact factor. Bear with me. I have no intention of giving it one, but that's really the metric that I'm looking for. And I do have a way of figuring that out. I'll tell you what I'm trying to do. So one small last digression into theory, and then we're going deep into the material, okay, I promise. After this last digression, everything will be quantitative. So there's two scholars, I think, that are framing this study, and I don't know if they're familiar to this audience. One of them is Drew McGann, who is a scholar originally of book history, something in the mode of Darnton, who came up, but has turned his attention to what I would call the transformation of book practice and the social practice surrounding books because of the changing media. And see, I see the samizdat system as an early example of a changing media, and that's why I'm interested. Catherine Hales is someone who's only known for working in digital, let's say, 21st century genre, but in fact, this book of hers, How We Think, is really about a whole history of media ecologies, and she's interested, for example, in the telegram. I have another project on telexes, so both of them are teaching me a very simple, this is the takeaway from the whole talk, like there's a lot of pictures, there's a lot of maps, but here's what I'm trying to say. I don't think we should think of TAMIZDAT or even extraterritorial publishing as a single publishing event ever, but always as an iterative practice. Always as something that starts in one place and transforms through movement and repetition and transformation. Much like we have seen with the book history, and as we have seen as well in all kinds of transformation of media ecologies. Okay, so into the journal. Here's the journal. Some people in this room have heard me present this so many times I feel guilty, but here it is. Here's the first issue of Cross-Currents. This is an image of a sculpture which was originally planned to be in Wenceslas Square in 1968, but then after the invasion was sent to the countryside. It's called Kaddish, and it's by Aleš Asheli. It's in memory of his father who died in World War II. And this is how the journal starts. And it's very much about geographic representation. I'm going to show you some tables of contents, because that's what I did with this project. I harvested them. And here's the table of contents of the first one. Just a couple of comments about them. You'll notice that there's a lot of attention to geographic representation. So there's usually texts in a single, I have to show you the whole table of contents. It's 3 pages. You just quickly, okay. So texts about every country, or in some cases, minority culture within Central Europe. Okay, that's one thing. A lot of commissioned texts and commissioned translations. Not so much in the first volume, but definitely later on, and we'll take a look at a couple of those. And then you'll also see, especially as the journal evolves, this is the 4th volume in 1985, what I call clusters of ideas, logics of collection, paratext again. Paratext for newly translated text. So let me give you some examples of that. Let's see if I can find a good one for you. Yes, there is. Going back to it. Oh, here's an example of a cluster of texts. So, Kundera had published an introduction to a variation. I believe it was a New York Review of Books or New Yorker, I can't remember which. Brodsky responded to it. What Matejka did here is he surrounded it with other texts. He put this text by Mazurek before it, and then he put this text by Czerny after, and then he had Miłosz write a kind of a summary essay about all of it. And that's a really common kind of configuration. And the claim I'm making here about iterative practice is that is taking something already published and in kind of a transformative art mode, making it into something new. I have one more really good example for you, which we heard about earlier today. Where did it go? No, not here. It's in the next volume that I call. Okay, here we go. This essay right here, Jews and Lithuanians. So you know this presentation is fresh because this wasn't the example I was going to use, but then Anne brought it up and I've written about it before, so I thought I would go ahead and use it. Okay, Anne already gave you, also she gave you the backstory. So essentially, she mentioned in passing that this text was published in Cross Currents, and it gives as its point of origin the Israeli journal. What Matejka does with this, and it's not in the table of contents, you actually have to read the article to find out, is he surrounds it with an entire conversation. So at the end of the essay, we have a letter which was sent to Venslova. But it wasn't sent to Cross Currents, and it wasn't sent to Targut. And here is where I'm going to introduce my TAMIZDAT system to you, and then I'm going to try to show you in Google Earth, and then I'm going to sit down. Okay? So, in February 1977, I happened to hear your article. Do I have it here? Yeah, I do. I have it up at the top. Jews and Lithuanians on the Russian language program of Radio Liberty. The article was published in one of the Jewish samizdat journals. Like, there's lots of them, and we all know about them, right? And was then reprinted by an Israeli journalist only, then came to be broadcast by Radio Liberty. I don't know if it was broadcast on the Lithuanian language program of Radio Liberty because the jamming makes it difficult to listen to them. But the very fact itself is quite paradoxical. In this century of the blossoming of means of mass information, the work of a Lithuanian writer becomes accessible to the Lithuanian reader only in this roundabout way, okay? So, the conversation itself is also worthy of an entire presentation. It's really about a kind of a nationalist reaction, like Žido komuna, blaming Jews for everything that happened to them in Lithuania, essentially, and Venslova's extremely elegant and graceful response. And he even, I think I have it here as a slide, not quite. At the end of all of this, because it happened in the late 70s, Matejka gives Venslova the chance to write a kind of an addendum and summarize it. Okay, so that's that story. But let me quickly, I have 3 minutes and that's just enough, switch computers and show you what's happening in the world with this. And my vision, I think I call it, how to think about this system. Okay, here we go. Here's where we thank the Hunter College IT department for letting this happen. All right, and some of you have seen me do this before. Again, I wasn't planning on it. I was going to show you different kinds of maps and charts and trees, but this seems much more relevant. And this, this is what I'm trying to describe. So here's the TAMIZDAT system as a flyover. Let me get my cursor. Where'd you go? Oh, there it is. Okay. So let's start here. I'm giving you an example of a text which was published underground. First, that's not the edition of it being published underground, but that's simply a reproduction of it. And here are some other texts that were published underground, and some of these are, this was the original samizdat edition. And this one too, I believe. And the next thing that happens after they're published underground in a typical, but not, not like a programmatic, but a typical trajectory, is that it would be, in fact, smuggled across the border and broadcast over RFE, and maybe over the BBC, depending on who was working there. There's C. So that's the second step, and then it iterates back in. And then we have radio signals. As it's not just broadcast, but remember, translated into the different services. So already we're talking about 3 iterations by my count. And then we have examples of times, just like we saw in that one Barskova piece, where someone hears the essay and transcribes it into a handwritten version, and then sometimes, not the same essay, but a different one gets published again in another iteration of underground or unofficial literature. Maybe gets published abroad, maybe gets translated into English, maybe gets published in Cross Currents, and then we have many examples of this, right? Watch out, we're going to get really dizzy. Maybe going back into the underground. So I have one text which actually follows that trajectory. And that's a good place for me to stop. I have a network graph which is really messy but shows you the beginning of how this works when I'm trying to trace that trajectory. But Phil's going to help me out to make it better soon. So stay tuned for that. Thank you.